The morning sunlight streamed through the window, soft and warm, illuminating a quiet room where a man sat in stillness. In front of him lay a cup of coffee, untouched, its heat fading just like the enthusiasm that once defined his life. Outside, the city bustled with the noise of people going about their day, but inside his thoughts were louder. His life from the outside seemed fine, good even. A stable job, a comfortable apartment, and friendships that kept him busy enough. Yet, deep within, he felt hollow, as though some invisible piece of the puzzle was missing. He had spent years chasing goals that promised satisfaction, promotions, social connections, and even hobbies. But every milestone reached only brought a fleeting sense of accomplishment. It puzzled him. Why, despite having what others might envy, did he feel so lost? He couldn't articulate it, but the feeling gnawed at him, especially in the quieter moments, when distractions couldn't shield him from his own mind. The answers weren't for lack of trying. His bookshelf was filled with titles boasting solutions. Find Your Purpose, The Keys to Happiness, 10 Steps to a Meaningful Life. He had read them all, and though their words resonated briefly, they left him where he began, wondering if something essential was missing, something these books couldn't name. Seminars and podcasts promised clarity, but as much as he tried to absorb their wisdom, the sense of unease remained. One day, while wandering aimlessly through the narrow streets of a part of town he rarely visited, his eyes caught sight of a small bookstore. Its facade was unimposing, almost hidden between towering modern buildings. Drawn by curiosity, he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, and the light inside was dim, the kind that made the world outside feel miles away. It was the sort of place where stories lived, waiting to be rediscovered. Walking through the rows of books, his gaze fell upon a leather-bound volume tucked between larger, more colorful titles. Its spine was cracked with age, and the cover bore no title, just an embossed pattern that had faded over time. Intrigued, he pulled it from the shelf. As he flipped through its yellowed pages, he noticed something unusual. A single chapter was marked with a red ribbon. On the page, written in bold but elegant letters, were the words, "Read this and you will understand everything." The claim was bold, almost absurd. He laughed quietly at the audacity of the statement, but a flicker of curiosity stopped him from putting the book back. What did it mean? Understand what, exactly? His life, his purpose, or the nagging emptiness that seemed to follow him everywhere? He wasn't sure, but he felt compelled to find out. He settled into an armchair by the store's single window, where light trickled in just enough to illuminate the page. As he began to read, the words on the paper unfolded a story, one that seemed to reflect his own. The narrative described a man who, like him, appeared to have everything but felt unfulfilled. This fictional character mirrored his thoughts, his struggles, and even his attempts to find meaning in the usual places. It was as if the book knew him, and as he read on, he found himself drawn deeper into its wisdom. The chapter spoke of an invisible barrier that keeps people from understanding themselves, a veil of distractions, fears, and assumptions. It wasn't just a story, it was a challenge. The narrative urged the reader to look inward, to confront the truths they'd avoided, and to embrace the complexities of their own mind and heart. The story suggested that the answers he sought weren't to be found in books, achievements, or the validation of others. They were within him, buried beneath layers of expectations and fear of failure. As the words sank in, he felt a quiet discomfort, but also an undeniable clarity. The chapter didn't offer easy solutions or affirmations that everything would magically improve. Instead, it posed questions that demanded courage and introspection. The story hinted at truths he had always known, but hadn't been ready to face. When he reached the end of the chapter, he closed the book, letting its weight rest in his lap. The promise to understand everything hadn't been a lie. though not in the way he initially expected. The book hadn't provided a roadmap or an instruction manual. Instead, it had offered him a mirror, showing him that the journey to understanding began with an honest look at himself. He placed the book back on the shelf and stepped outside into the daylight. The city hadn't changed, but something inside him had shifted. It wasn't that all his questions were answered, far from it. But now he understood that clarity wasn't something to be handed to him. It was something he had to work toward, step by step, by peeling back the layers of his own doubts and fears. The journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to take it. The man continued to read, his eyes glued to the aged, slightly crinkled pages of the book. It was remarkable how the story he had stumbled upon seemed to speak directly to his soul, as if it had been written for him alone. Every word felt like it had been carefully crafted to address the void he had been unable to name, and the chapter unfolded like a mirror to his own thoughts and struggles. The narrative introduced a kingdom, one that was grand yet deeply troubled. It was a place of contradictions, where prosperity coexisted with discontent, and unity seemed like an impossible dream. This fictional kingdom wasn't ruled by a single king or queen, but rather by many voices, each representing different aspects of the human condition. One voice was ambition, always demanding more, urging its people to reach for higher achievements and greater power. Another was fear, which urged caution and restraint, whispering of potential losses and dangers at every turn. Hope was another ruler, always looking to the future, believing in possibilities yet unrealized. Then there was doubt, an insidious presence that questioned every action and decision. Together, these voices created an endless cacophony that left the kingdom in chaos, unable to find peace or direction. As the man read about the kingdom, he couldn't help but draw parallels to his own mind. He recognized those same voices within himself, ambition, fear, hope, and doubt, all competing for dominance, each pulling him in different directions. The description was uncannily accurate, as if the book had somehow tapped into his innermost thoughts. The kingdom's turmoil felt familiar because it mirrored the battle raging within him, a conflict he had never fully understood until now. The story introduced a central figure, a sage who appeared not as a ruler, but as a guide. The sage wasn't aligned with any of the voices. Instead, he sought to bring them into harmony. The sage explained that the kingdom's problem wasn't the existence of these voices, but their inability to work together. Each voice had its role, its purpose, but when left unchecked, they created discord. Ambition without compassion could lead to selfishness. Fear without courage could lead to paralysis. Hope without grounding in reality could lead to delusion, and doubt without balance could erode confidence. The sage's mission was to help the kingdom recognize the value of each voice, while teaching them to coexist in unity. As the man read about the sage's teachings, he felt a growing sense of clarity. The sage's words seemed to echo truths he had always known, but had never articulated. The idea that his inner turmoil stemmed not from the existence of conflicting emotions, but from his inability to reconcile them, resonated deeply. He realized that he had spent years trying to silence certain parts of himself, his fears, his doubts, believing them to be obstacles to his happiness. But the sage suggested a different approach. Instead of fighting these parts, he needed to understand and integrate them. The narrative took a turn as the sage led the protagonist of the story, a character much like the man himself, on a journey through the kingdom. Their first stop was a bustling marketplace, a place teeming with life and activity. Here, ambition reigned supreme. The vendors shouted over one another, each trying to outdo the rest, their stalls overflowing with goods and treasures. At first glance, the marketplace seemed vibrant and successful, but the sage pointed out the underlying tension. The competition was so fierce that it bred resentment and mistrust among the vendors. Ambition drives progress, the sage explained, but without cooperation, it creates division. Next, they visited a quiet forest on the outskirts of the kingdom, a place governed by fear. The trees were tall and imposing, their branches casting long shadows that seemed to envelop everything in darkness. The people who lived here moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, always on the lookout for danger. Fear had kept them safe from harm, but it had also imprisoned them, preventing them from venturing beyond the forest's edge. Fear is a protector, the sage said, but when it becomes all-consuming, it stifles growth and discovery. Their journey continued to a grand tower that stretched toward the heavens, its top hidden by the clouds. This was the realm of hope, where the people gazed upward, dreaming of what lay beyond. The sage admired their optimism, but noted the fragility of their foundation. The tower was built on unstable ground, and though it reached great heights, it was at constant risk of collapse. "Hope inspires us to reach for the stars," the sage said, "but without a solid foundation it cannot sustain us." Finally, they arrived at a desolate wasteland, a place ruled by doubt. Here the air was thick with hesitation, and the ground was littered with unfinished projects. The people were paralyzed, unable to move forward, because they questioned every step they took. The sage acknowledged the value of doubt as a tool for self-examination, but warned against allowing it to dominate. "Doubt can protect us from recklessness," he said, "but if left unchecked, it becomes a prison." The man paused his reading, letting the story sink in. He could see pieces of himself in every corner of the kingdom, in the marketplace's relentless ambition, the forest's consuming fear, the tower's fragile hope, and the wasteland's crippling doubt. The sage's wisdom felt like a lifeline, offering a way to bring these disparate parts of himself into balance. But the journey wasn't over yet. The chapter described a climactic moment when the protagonist stood before a hall of mirrors, a sacred place at the heart of the kingdom. Each mirror reflected a different aspect of his being, not just his physical appearance, but also his thoughts, emotions, and memories. Some mirrors showed his strengths, others his weaknesses. Some revealed dreams he had forgotten, while others forced him to confront fears he had buried deep within. It was a harrowing experience. The protagonist wanted to look away, to avoid facing the reflections that made him uncomfortable, but the sage urged him to stand firm. "These mirrors do not lie," the sage said. "They show you who you are in all your complexity. To find peace, you must embrace every part of yourself." As the protagonist gazed into the mirrors, he began to see the connections between the different parts of his identity. He realized that his ambition was fueled by hope, that his fear stemmed from doubt, and that his strengths and weaknesses were two sides of the same coin. This understanding allowed him to accept himself fully, to see his imperfections not as flaws, but as integral pieces of his humanity. The man closed the book for a moment, his heart pounding. The chapter had drawn him in completely, making him feel as if he were the protagonist. The sage's teachings resonated deeply, offering a roadmap for understanding the conflicts that had plagued him for so long. He reopened the book, eager to see how the story concluded. The protagonist emerged from the Hall of Mirrors, transformed. He returned to the kingdom, bringing with him a newfound sense of harmony. He began to mediate between the voices, encouraging them to work together rather than compete. Ambition learned to temper its drive with compassion. Fear found courage in hope. Doubt was balanced by trust, and hope, grounded by reality, became a beacon of inspiration. The kingdom began to thrive, not because its problems had disappeared, but because its people had learned to navigate their complexities with wisdom and grace. The sage's final words to the protagonist were simple yet profound. "The path to understanding lies within. Look inward, and you will find your way." The man set the book down, his mind racing. The chapter hadn't offered easy answers or quick fixes, But it had illuminated a path forward, a path that required courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront the truths within himself. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope, not the fragile kind that rested on external circumstances, but a steady, enduring hope rooted in self-awareness. As the man closed the book momentarily, his mind swirled with the implications of what he had read. He felt a profound resonance with the story, yet at the same time, an unsettling realization crept in. The narrative had given him insight into the fragmented nature of his thoughts, desires, and emotions, but knowing this and acting on it felt like two entirely different challenges. The sage's words had planted a seed of clarity, yet the man realized that clarity alone was not enough to uproot the entrenched doubts, fears, and contradictions that had taken hold of his life over the years. Sitting in the quiet of his living room, he began to feel the weight of his inner turmoil more acutely than ever before. It was as though the chapter had illuminated a labyrinth inside him, a maze that he had long avoided exploring. He could see the paths of his ambition, his hopes, his fears, and his doubts intertwining, but navigating them felt overwhelming. Where should he begin? Was there even a way to reconcile these conflicting parts of himself? The voice of doubt was the loudest. It questioned the validity of everything he had just read. Was this really the key to understanding his life? Or was it just a cleverly written story designed to manipulate emotions? Doubt whispered that introspection was futile, that his struggles were just part of life and nothing could truly change. This voice had been with him for as long as he could remember, a constant companion that had both protected him from reckless decisions and paralyzed him with inaction. But alongside doubt, ambition began to stir. It reminded him of the moments when he had dared to dream bigger, when he had believed in his potential to create a life of meaning and fulfillment. Ambition urged him to take the first step, to use the wisdom from the book as a tool to shape his future. Yet even as ambition spoke, fear rose up, warning him of the risks. What if he failed? What if this journey inward revealed truths he wasn't ready to face? Fear painted vivid pictures of the discomfort and pain that might come from digging too deep. Hope, faint but persistent, tried to push through the noise. It reminded him of the sage's words about harmony and the possibility of finding peace within himself. Hope urged him to trust the process, to believe that even the smallest steps toward self-awareness could lead to transformation. But hope, fragile as it was, struggled to hold its ground against the stronger, more cynical voices. The man found himself caught in a mental tug-of-war, each voice pulling him in a different direction. It was exhausting, this constant back and forth, this inability to commit to a single path. He felt like the protagonist in the story, standing before the hall of mirrors, but unable to step inside. The reflections were too daunting, too revealing. To confront them felt like an insurmountable challenge, yet avoiding them felt like a betrayal of the clarity he had just begun to glimpse. As the hours passed, his thoughts spiraled further. He replayed moments from his past, searching for clues to his current state. He thought of the times when he had chased after external achievements, believing they would bring him happiness, only to feel emptier with each milestone reached. He recalled moments when fear had held him back from pursuing opportunities, convincing him that the risks weren't worth it. He remembered the times when doubt had whispered in his ear, making him question his capabilities and decisions. Each memory brought with it a wave of emotion: regret for the chances not taken, frustration at the cycles he couldn't seem to break, and sadness for the years spent searching for something he couldn't name. Yet amidst the chaos of these emotions, a quieter realization began to take shape. The very act of revisiting these memories, painful as it was, seemed to hold a kind of power. It was as though the process of examining his past was allowing him to piece together a narrative, to see patterns and connections that had previously eluded him. He thought back to the marketplace, the forest, the tower, and the wasteland from the story. Each place represented a part of himself, and he began to see how these parts had played out in his own life. Ambition had driven him to succeed, but it had also blinded him to the importance of connection and balance. Fear had protected him from harm, but it had also kept him from taking risks that might have led to growth. Hope had inspired him, but it had also made him vulnerable to disappointment. Doubt had kept him grounded, but it had also prevented him from trusting himself. The complexity of these realizations was both empowering and paralyzing. He saw himself more clearly than ever before, yet he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with this clarity. To acknowledge these parts of himself was one thing. To integrate them into a cohesive whole was another. He understood now that the path to understanding wasn't a linear journey with a clear destination. It was a process, messy and unpredictable, requiring both courage and patience. As the evening turned into night, he found himself drawn back to the book. He opened it again, not to reread the chapter, but to sit with it, to let its words and symbols sink deeper into his consciousness. He thought of the sage, not as a character in a story, but as a representation of his own inner wisdom. The sage's role wasn't to provide answers, but to guide the protagonist toward self-discovery, and he realized that he needed to step into that role for himself. The conflict within him hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt more intense than ever. But for the first time, he didn't see it as a problem to be solved or an enemy to be defeated. Instead, he began to see it as a dialogue, a conversation between the different parts of himself that had been waiting to be heard. The voices of ambition, fear, hope, and doubt were not adversaries but companions, each with something valuable to offer. This shift in perspective didn't resolve the conflict, but it changed the way he approached it. He began to see his inner turmoil not as a sign of weakness, but as an invitation to grow. The journey ahead still felt daunting, but the chapter had given him a map, however incomplete. He didn't know exactly where it would lead, but for the first time, he felt ready to take the first step. The room was dimly lit as the man leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edges of the book like a lifeline. The story had brought him to a critical juncture, and he felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward what was unfolding on the page. The protagonist, who mirrored his own journey so closely, had reached the Hall of Mirrors, the place the sage had described as the heart of the kingdom and the key to its harmony. This hall was not merely a physical space, but a symbolic crucible, a place where every truth, hidden and overt, would be laid bare. The protagonist hesitated at the entrance, a massive arched doorway carved with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The sage stood beside him, silent, offering no reassurance, only a steady presence. The man could almost feel the weight of the protagonist's hesitation, the same kind of reluctance he often felt when confronting parts of himself he wished to ignore. To step into the Hall of Mirrors was to face the unfiltered truth of one's existence, and the enormity of that task was almost paralyzing. With a deep breath, the protagonist took the first step inside, and the man reading felt as though he had crossed the threshold with him. The hall was vast, its walls lined with mirrors of every shape and size, stretching upward into an infinite darkness. Each mirror shimmered faintly, as if alive, and the air was thick with an almost tangible energy. The protagonist approached the nearest mirror, his reflection staring back at him with an intensity that made him flinch. But this was no ordinary reflection. As he looked closer, he saw not just his physical form, but fragments of his memories, emotions, and unspoken fears rippling across the glass. The man reading felt a jolt as the narrative described what the protagonist saw, images from his childhood, moments of joy interwoven with pain. A scene played out in one mirror, a younger version of the protagonist reaching out for approval from a distant figure, only to be met with indifference. In another, he saw himself as an adult, achieving a significant milestone but feeling an emptiness that no applause could fill. These reflections weren't just visual. They carried the weight of emotion, forcing the protagonist to relive them with an intensity that was both overwhelming and cathartic. The sage's voice broke through the silence, calm yet unyielding. You cannot look away. To understand, you must see it all. The protagonist clenched his fists, his body tense, but he obeyed. He moved from mirror to mirror, each one revealing another layer of his existence. Some mirrors showed his successes, moments of triumph and pride, but even these carried undercurrents of doubt. Others displayed his regrets, the roads not taken, the words left unsaid. The protagonist's chest tightened as he confronted these fragments of himself, each one a piece of a puzzle he had never fully understood. As the man reading followed the protagonist's journey, he felt his own memories bubbling to the surface. It was as though the book had become his own hall of mirrors, reflecting parts of his life he had long buried. He saw moments of vulnerability, times when he had allowed fear to dictate his choices, and instances of joy that he had taken for granted. The parallels between his life and the story were almost eerie, and he couldn't help but wonder if the author had experienced something similar, some deep reckoning that had inspired this narrative. Back in the story, the protagonist reached a particularly large mirror, its surface swirling like liquid silver. This mirror was different, more opaque, as if reluctant to reveal its contents. The sage stepped closer, his presence both reassuring and challenging. "This is the core of your being," he said. "It will show you not only who you are, but who you could become." The protagonist hesitated, his hand hovering inches from the mirror's surface. The man reading could feel the tension in this moment, the gravity of what was about to be unveiled. When the protagonist finally touched the mirror, it rippled like water, and an image emerged, a vision of himself, but not as he was. This version of him was confident, grounded, radiating a sense of purpose and peace. The protagonist stared, mesmerized and disoriented. This was who he could be, the reflection seemed to say, if he could align the disparate parts of himself, if he could integrate his fears, hopes, doubts, and ambitions into a cohesive whole. But the mirror didn't stop there. It also showed the obstacles that lay ahead, the challenges he would need to overcome to reach this version of himself. The man reading felt his breath catch as the description of the mirror deepened. It didn't just show potential, it showed the raw, unvarnished truth. The protagonist saw his strengths, but also his flaws, the ways he had hurt others knowingly or unknowingly, and the ways he had sabotaged himself. The mirror didn't judge. It simply reflected. But in its neutrality, it demanded accountability. The protagonist felt a wave of emotion, shame, regret, hope, and determination all crashing over him at once. The sage spoke again, his voice steady. "This is not a destination, but a direction. What you see here is not guaranteed, nor is it unattainable. It is a possibility, shaped by the choices you make from this moment forward." The protagonist nodded, tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from the profound weight of understanding. He had always sought clarity outside himself, in achievements, in relationships, in external validation. But the mirror had shown him that the answers lay within. As the protagonist stepped back from the mirror, he noticed something he hadn't before. The other mirrors, the ones that had shown fragmented pieces of his life, were beginning to change. The images within them were no longer isolated moments, but part of a larger narrative. He saw how his fears had pushed him toward caution, but had also protected him. He saw how his ambition had driven him, but had also blinded him to the present. He saw how his doubts had made him question his path, but had also led him to deeper truths. The mirrors were no longer separate. They were interconnected, each one a thread in the tapestry of his existence. The man reading felt a similar shift within himself. The story was no longer just a story. It was a catalyst. It had forced him to confront the fragmented pieces of his own life, to see how they fit together in ways he hadn't recognized before. He realized that his fears, doubts, and ambitions weren't enemies to be defeated, but allies to be understood. They were part of him, and to reject them would be to reject himself. As the protagonist left the Hall of Mirrors, the sage's final words echoed in the man's mind. "You have seen who you are and who you can be. The choice is yours, not to become someone else, but to become wholly yourself." The protagonist nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to take it. The man closed the book, his hands trembling. The story had reached into the deepest parts of him, parts he had long ignored or denied. He sat in silence, letting the weight of what he had read settle over him. The Hall of Mirrors had been a fictional construct, but its truth was undeniable. To understand himself, he would have to step into his own hall, to face his own reflections, no matter how painful or uncomfortable they might be. And yet, despite the enormity of the task, he felt a sense of hope. The story had shown him that clarity wasn't about having all the answers, but about being willing to ask the questions, to look inward with honesty and courage. For the first time in years, he felt not just the possibility, but the promise of transformation. The path would be long, but it would be his own, and that was enough. The man sat in silence, the book resting on his lap. The room was still, the faint hum of life outside muffled by the weight of his thoughts. The final moments of the chapter had left an indelible mark on him, not with answers, but with a sense of direction. He closed the book carefully, as if sealing a pact with himself. The air around him felt charged, as though the words had transformed not only his perspective, but the space he occupied. Yet the world outside remained unchanged. The hum of passing cars, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant laughter of children, all reminders that life moved on, indifferent to the profound shift within him. He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. The act of moving felt strange, as if his body were out of sync with the clarity now pulsing through his mind. He placed the book gently on the table, its worn cover now imbued with an almost sacred significance. He didn't need to open it again. Its message had etched itself into his consciousness. For a moment he lingered by the window, watching the street below. It was ordinary, almost mundane. A delivery truck idling by the curb, a neighbor watering her plants. But for the first time, he noticed the details he had overlooked for years. The way the sunlight glinted off the windows, the rhythmic sway of tree branches in the wind, the soft ripple of a curtain caught in a breeze. It all seemed alive. There was no dramatic proclamation, no grand gesture. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He felt it in the way his breath came easier, in the steadiness of his heartbeat. The internal cacophony that had once dominated his thoughts now felt quieter, not silenced, but softened, as if the voices had found a rhythm they could share. He knew the journey was far from over. This was merely a beginning. But for the first time, he felt capable of taking the next step. The kitchen table was cluttered with remnants of his morning routine. A half-empty coffee cup, a plate with crumbs from a hurried breakfast, a crumpled napkin. He cleared it slowly, not out of obligation, but as an act of care. Each item returned to its place with intention, a small but significant gesture of reclaiming control over his environment. The act felt symbolic, as though by creating order in his physical space, he was reinforcing the newfound balance within himself. As the day unfolded, he found himself approaching his tasks with a different energy. The emails he had been dreading no longer felt like insurmountable obstacles. They were simply tasks to be addressed, one at a time. The conversations he had been avoiding, apologies unspoken, feelings unexpressed, began to feel less daunting. He realized that the fear holding him back wasn't rooted in the external world, but in his own mind, a manifestation of the doubts and insecurities he had carried for so long. He decided to take a walk, something he hadn't done in weeks. The streets he had walked countless times before now seemed unfamiliar, as if he were seeing them through new eyes. He noticed the cracks in the pavement, the faded paint on a mailbox, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves of an old oak tree. These were things he had passed by 100 times without a second thought, but now they seemed to pulse with meaning, as though the world itself had opened up to him. At the park, he sat on a bench, watching the world unfold around him. A group of children chased each other across the grass, their laughter ringing out like a melody. An older couple strolled hand in hand, their pace unhurried, their smiles serene. A dog barked excitedly as its owner threw a ball into the distance. These scenes were ordinary, yet they held a beauty he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that he had changed, and in doing so, he could see the world more clearly. The thoughts that once swirled chaotically in his mind now felt like a river, flowing steadily, each idea and emotion finding its place. He thought about the relationships in his life, the ones he had nurtured and the ones he had let wither. He thought about his work, not as a source of stress, but as an extension of his abilities and values. He thought about his dreams, the ones he had dismissed as unrealistic or impractical, and felt a spark of curiosity reignite within him. What if those dreams weren't as out of reach as he had believed? What if the only thing standing between him and those possibilities was his own reluctance to try? By the time he returned home, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the city. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the warmth of his space. It wasn't perfect. The furniture was mismatched. The walls could use a fresh coat of paint. But it was his, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like enough. He sat down at his desk, a place that had often been a source of frustration, and opened his notebook. The blank page stared back at him, but instead of feeling intimidating, it felt inviting. He picked up his pen and began to write, not with a specific goal in mind, but simply to capture the thoughts and feelings coursing through him. The words flowed easily, unfiltered and honest. He wrote about the book, the mirrors, the sage, and the kingdom. He wrote about the voices within him, the conflicts and harmonies that had shaped his life. He wrote about his fears and doubts, but also his hopes and ambitions. The act of writing felt like a conversation with himself, a way of solidifying the insights he had gained and setting intentions for the journey ahead. As the evening deepened into night, he closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt comforting rather than lonely. He looked around, taking in the details of his life. The books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, the plants on the windowsill. Each item told a story, a fragment of who he was, and together they formed a mosaic of his existence. The book still sat on the table, its presence a reminder of the path that had brought him here. He didn't know if he would read it again, or if it would remain closed, a chapter completed. What he did know was that it had given him something invaluable, a sense of clarity, not about the world, but about himself. It had shown him that understanding wasn't about having all the answers, but about being willing to ask the questions, to confront the unknown with curiosity and courage. As he prepared for bed, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from resolving every problem or achieving every goal, but the kind that came from knowing he was on the right path, however uncertain it might be. The voices within him, the ambition, the fear, the hope, the doubt, were still there, but they no longer felt like adversaries. They were parts of him, each with a role to play, and for the first time, he felt ready to listen to them all. He turned off the light and lay down, the quiet hum of the city outside lulling him into a calm he hadn't felt in years. The journey wasn't over, but he was no longer afraid of it. The mirrors had shown him who he was, and in doing so, they had shown him who he could become. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a deep, unshakable truth settle within him. The answers he had been searching for were not in the book, the mirrors, or even the sage. They were, and always had been, within himself. The man woke up the next morning feeling a subtle yet profound difference. The weight that had clung to him for years seemed lighter, almost as though it had been replaced by something intangible but steady. The sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light onto the room, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't immediately reach for his phone or feel the pangs of rushing thoughts waiting to flood his mind. He sat quietly, letting the moment settle over him, the remnants of yesterday's revelation still vivid in his memory. He reflected on the journey he had undertaken, though it had taken place entirely within the confines of his own mind. The mirrors from the story lingered in his thoughts, vivid and alive, not as physical objects but as metaphors for the truths he had faced. It occurred to him that the clarity he now felt wasn't something external or foreign. It wasn't a gift from the book, nor from the mysterious sage within its pages. Instead, it was something that had always been within him, waiting to be discovered, waiting for him to pause long enough to listen. This realization, while simple in its nature, carried an immense weight. He thought about the years he had spent searching for answers in the world around him, in the expectations of others, in his accomplishments, and even in fleeting distractions that had numbed him temporarily. These external pursuits had given him fragments of satisfaction, but had never addressed the deeper questions he carried in his heart. The story had shifted something fundamental in him, by reminding him that no external success or validation could replace the inner work of understanding oneself. He walked to the kitchen, preparing a cup of tea with deliberate movements, feeling grounded in the simplicity of the act. As the kettle whistled, he found himself thinking about the interconnectedness of everything he had experienced. The story, the mirrors, the sage, and even the voices within himself. They all seemed to be pieces of a larger puzzle. He realized that each part of him, whether it was his ambition or his fear, was necessary. They were not flaws to be erased, but threads that, when woven together, created the unique tapestry of who he was. As the tea steeped, he thought about the idea of harmony, a theme that had resonated deeply in the story. Harmony didn't mean erasing conflict or silencing the voices within him. It meant allowing those voices to coexist, each contributing its own wisdom and perspective. Ambition could drive him forward, but it needed to be tempered by compassion. Fear could protect him, but it had to be balanced by courage. Hope could inspire him, but it needed to be grounded in reality. Doubt could challenge him, but it also had to give way to trust. This balance was not something he could achieve overnight, but understanding its importance was the first step. The act of sipping his tea became almost meditative, a way of anchoring himself to the present moment. He thought about how often he had let time slip through his fingers, his mind preoccupied with the past or the future. The story had reminded him that clarity could only be found in the present, in the act of fully inhabiting each moment. It was in these quiet, ordinary moments that he felt the greatest sense of peace, a kind of stillness that made the world feel less chaotic and more manageable. He considered the spiritual undertones of what he had learned, though he hadn't thought of himself as a particularly spiritual person before. The idea that understanding came from within, that the answers he sought were not in the world around him, but in his ability to reflect and listen to himself, felt deeply connected to something greater. It wasn't about religion or doctrine, it was about a connection to the essence of life, to the energy that flowed through him and everything else. This realization filled him with a quiet gratitude, not for anything specific, but for the simple fact of being alive, of being part of this vast, mysterious existence. Later in the day, he went for a walk, his footsteps deliberate, his pace unhurried. The world around him seemed both unchanged and entirely new. He noticed the details he had overlooked before, the intricate patterns on leaves, the subtle play of light and shadow on the pavement, the way the wind carried the faint scent of flowers from a nearby garden. These small observations filled him with a sense of wonder, as though he were seeing the world for the first time. He realized that clarity wasn't about solving life's mysteries, but about appreciating them, about finding beauty in the questions themselves. As he walked, he thought about the people in his life, friends, family, colleagues, even strangers he had crossed paths with. The story had shown him that his inner world was deeply connected to his relationships with others. The same voices that spoke within him, ambition, fear, hope, and doubt, were present in everyone, shaping their actions and decisions. This understanding made him feel more compassionate, more patient. He realized that the conflicts he had experienced with others were often reflections of the conflicts within himself. By finding harmony within, he could bring a sense of peace to his interactions with others. He returned home as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light across the sky. He sat by the window, watching as the colors shifted from gold to pink to deep blue. The day had been ordinary in many ways. There had been no grand events, no dramatic changes, but it felt extraordinary to him. He realized that the transformation he had experienced wasn't about changing his circumstances. It was about changing the way he saw and experienced the world. As the evening deepened, he felt a quiet resolve take root within him. The clarity he had gained wasn't a destination. It was a starting point. The journey ahead would not be without challenges, but he felt ready to face them. Not with the goal of achieving perfection, but with the intention of living authentically. He understood now that life wasn't about finding definitive answers, but about asking meaningful questions, about being curious and open to what each moment had to teach. The book still sat on the table, its worn cover catching the soft light of a nearby lamp. He didn't feel the need to open it again, but its presence was a reminder of the journey it had sparked. It had been a guide, not a savior, and for that he was grateful. The story had given him the tools to look within himself, to see the parts he had hidden and the parts he had celebrated, and to understand that they were all necessary, all valuable. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet settle over him. The voices within him were still there, but they felt different now, less like competing forces and more like a chorus, each voice contributing to the symphony of who he was. He realized that the promise of the story, that he would understand everything, had been true, but not in the way he had expected. It wasn't about understanding the world or unraveling its mysteries. It was about understanding himself, about seeing the beauty in his complexity and embracing the journey of becoming. As he sat there, the evening fading into night, he felt a profound sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from certainty or resolution, but the kind that came from acceptance, from knowing that he didn't have to have all the answers, that it was enough to keep asking the questions, to keep looking inward, and to keep moving forward with an open heart and mind. In that moment, he felt whole, not because he had reached the end of his journey, but because he had found the courage to begin. The night deepened, wrapping the world outside in a tranquil darkness. He remained seated by the window, his mind quiet yet alive with thoughts that no longer raced, but instead flowed gently, like a calm river. The day had been transformative in ways that were difficult to describe. It was not the kind of change that would be immediately visible to others. There was no dramatic shift in his life circumstances, no outward sign of the revelations that had taken root in his soul. But he felt it, unmistakably, in the way his chest no longer carried the same weight, in the way his breath came easier, deeper. He thought about the people who might never find their way to this kind of clarity, not because they weren't capable, but because the world often demanded so much from them that they forgot to look inward. The story he had read, the mirrors, the sage. These were tools that had reminded him of something he had always known, but never had the courage to confront. The thought filled him with a sense of responsibility. If he could find this clarity, perhaps he could help others see their own. Not by preaching or advising, but simply by being an example, by living authentically and showing that it was possible to find peace amidst life's chaos. He recalled something the sage had said in the story. The world reflects what you carry within you. It was a simple truth, but one that resonated deeply now. For years, he had carried chaos, fear, and dissatisfaction within himself, and he had seen those same things reflected in his experiences and relationships. But now, as he began to carry acceptance, balance, and a willingness to grow, he wondered how the world around him might begin to change in response. The thought wasn't rooted in a desire for control or manipulation, but in a sense of curiosity and hope. What would happen if he approached the people in his life with more patience, more understanding? What if he listened, really listened, to their voices instead of waiting for his turn to speak? What if he stopped seeing their flaws and mistakes as obstacles, and instead recognized them as reflections of his own struggles? The idea wasn't about fixing others or making them conform to his expectations, but about meeting them where they were, just as he was learning to meet himself. He thought about his work, the tasks that had once felt monotonous and burdensome. They would still require effort and discipline, but he realized they could also be opportunities for growth and creativity. The mundane could be meaningful if approached with the right mindset. It wasn't about finding joy in every moment, but about finding purpose, even in the moments that felt tedious or challenging. This shift in perspective wasn't something he could sustain effortlessly. It would take practice, but he felt ready to try. As he prepared to sleep, he decided to write a few notes in his journal, a habit he had tried to cultivate in the past, but had abandoned when it felt like a chore. This time, it was different. He didn't write out of obligation or to meet a goal, but simply to capture the thoughts and feelings that had emerged throughout the day. The words flowed easily, unpolished, but genuine, a reflection of the clarity he had begun to nurture. He wrote about the story, the mirrors and the sage, but he also wrote about the small moments that had felt significant. The sunlight on the leaves, the laughter of children in the park, the quiet comfort of sipping tea. These were the things he wanted to hold on to, not as fleeting pleasures, but as reminders of what it meant to be fully present, fully alive. As he closed the journal, he felt a sense of closure, not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of completing a chapter. The journey he had begun wasn't finished. It might never be finished, and that was okay. Life wasn't a puzzle to be solved or a mountain to be conquered. It was a series of moments, each one an opportunity to learn, to grow, to connect. Lying in bed, he let the stillness of the night envelop him. The city outside was quiet now, the occasional sound of a car passing in the distance, the only reminder that the world continued to move. He felt no urgency, no rush to plan or analyze. The questions that had once consumed him, the why and how of everything, seemed less pressing. The answers might come or they might not, but either way, he had found something more important: the ability to sit with the questions and let them be. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought about the title of the chapter that had started it all: "You Will Understand Everything." At first he had taken it literally, expecting the story to reveal some grand universal truth that would make sense of his life. But now he realized that understanding wasn't about knowing everything. It was about being open to what was already there. It was about accepting the complexity of his own mind and heart, about embracing the uncertainties and contradictions that made him human. The clarity he had found wasn't a destination, but a way of moving through the world. It was a lens through which he could see himself and others with more compassion, more patience, and more curiosity. It was a reminder that the journey was the reward, that the act of seeking was itself an act of understanding. And as sleep took him, he felt a quiet joy, not the fleeting kind that came from achievement or validation, but the steady, enduring kind that came from being at peace with himself. The soft rhythm of his breathing filled the quiet room as the man lay in bed, eyes closed but mind quietly alive. He wasn't replaying the conflicts or doubts that used to occupy his thoughts at night. Instead, he was immersed in a sense of profound calm. The clarity he had gained felt like a fragile flame, not blazing, but steady, illuminating parts of himself he had long neglected. Though he had drifted into the familiar comfort of his bed, it felt as though he were on the cusp of something much larger. A journey, not outward, but inward, where every step required courage, patience, and a willingness to grow. The night outside deepened, and with it, his thoughts settled into a space he rarely allowed himself to inhabit. He thought about the many years he had spent chasing ideas of success and fulfillment that had always seemed just out of reach. Achievements he once considered monumental now felt strangely hollow in hindsight. They had brought fleeting moments of pride, but had done little to satisfy the deeper yearning within him, the longing for meaning, connection, and wholeness. He realized that much of his life had been spent seeking validation from the external world, as though the opinions of others could fill the void he carried inside. Yet none of it had worked, because the source of his restlessness had never been external. He thought back to the mirrors from the story, their images as vivid now as they had been when he read them. Those reflections had shown him the truth of who he was, not just the polished surface he presented to the world, but the entirety of his being, including the parts he had avoided confronting. The mirrors had revealed his fears, his regrets, his hopes, and his strengths, not as separate entities, but as interconnected facets of his identity. This understanding, that he was not defined by any single part of himself but by the whole, was liberating. It allowed him to see his imperfections, not as failures, but as integral pieces of the puzzle that made him who he was. The idea of harmony resonated deeply with him. For so long, he had believed that achieving peace meant silencing the parts of himself that caused discomfort, his doubts, his fears, his insecurities. But the story had shown him that peace wasn't about erasure. It was about integration. It was about allowing all the voices within him to coexist, to find their place in the symphony of his mind. Ambition could drive him forward, but it needed to be tempered by wisdom. Fear could protect him, but it had to be balanced with courage. Hope could inspire him, but it needed the grounding of reality. Doubt could keep him cautious, but it had to coexist with trust. These voices weren't enemies, they were allies, each with a role to play. As the hours passed, he reflected on how this newfound perspective might shape his life. He thought about the people he had pushed away, not out of malice, but because he had been too caught up in his own struggles to truly connect with them. He thought about the dreams he had abandoned, not because they were unattainable, but because he had been too afraid to fail. He thought about the moments he had let slip by, too distracted by his own thoughts to appreciate the beauty around him. These reflections didn't fill him with regret, but with a sense of possibility. The past could not be changed, but the future was unwritten, and he now held the pen. The act of revisiting these memories felt cathartic, like opening a series of locked doors within himself. Each memory, no matter how painful or bittersweet, carried a lesson. He began to see how his experiences, both good and bad, had shaped him, how they had brought him to this exact moment. The clarity he now felt wasn't about erasing the past or denying his mistakes. It was about learning from them, about using them as stepping stones toward a more authentic life. The room grew darker as the night deepened, the faint glow of the moon casting soft shadows across the walls. He thought about the book and the way it had shifted his perspective, not by offering easy answers, but by asking the right questions. The sage's words lingered in his mind, their simplicity belying their depth. You cannot understand the world until you understand yourself. It was a truth he had resisted for so long, distracted by the noise of modern life, by the endless demands and expectations that had pulled him away from his own center. But now, having glimpsed what lay within, he knew he could never go back to the way things were. He considered what it meant to truly understand himself. It wasn't about achieving some final, perfect clarity, but about being willing to continue the journey, to keep asking the questions even when the answers weren't immediately clear. It was about accepting that life was messy, that growth was never linear, and that understanding was an ongoing process. The sage's words had planted a seed within him, a reminder that the journey was not about reaching a destination, but about embracing the path itself. His thoughts turned to the world beyond his room, the people, the places, the challenges that awaited him. He knew that the clarity he had gained wouldn't shield him from difficulties or setbacks. Life would continue to test him, to present obstacles that would challenge his resolve. But he also knew that he now had a foundation, a sense of inner balance that could help him navigate whatever lay ahead. He felt a quiet determination take root within him, a commitment not to perfection, but to growth, not to certainty, but to curiosity. The stillness of the night seemed to echo his thoughts, a reminder of the vastness of existence and the small but significant role he played within it. He thought about the connections that bound him to others, the invisible threads that linked him to the world around him. The story had shown him that understanding wasn't just an individual pursuit, it was a collective one. By finding harmony within himself, he could bring a sense of peace to his relationships, his work, and his community. The clarity he had gained wasn't just for him. It was something he could share, not through words but through actions, through the way he lived his life. As the first light of dawn began to creep into the room, he felt a sense of renewal, as though the new day mirrored the new beginning he had found within himself. He sat up, stretching his arms and taking a deep breath. The world outside was waking up, and so was he. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be his own, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough.